It's my pleasure to introduce Alexander Smith. Alex got his PhD from University of Hawaii in 2017 and has been teaching in University of North Texas, which is also where he got his BA and MA. I don't know if Alex would call himself a true Texan, but he is surely a true Austronesianist. For one thing, if you go to austronesians.com, you will reach his website. For another, he has been working extensively on diachronic phonology, documentation, and history of Austronesian languages. He's the author of not one, not two, but 3 chapters in the upcoming Oxford Guide to the Western Austronesian Languages. Since 2014, he has had 5 field work trips in Malaysia and Indonesia. We hope to have him back soon in this corner of the world. Currently, he's working on Austro-Thai studies, the study of Kratai and Austronesian as sister subgroups descended from an ancient Proto-Austro-Thai language that was spoken in southeastern China. He's also working on modeling the diachrony of Austronesian metrical phonology as a product of constraint movement and interaction, the result of which I think he will share with us today in his invited talk titled Tracing the Path of Constraint Movement, the Austronesian Binary Foot Requirement and Word Minimum Phenomena. Take it away, Alex.
Okay, can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great. So first I just want to, well, I think first I need to start my timer. In 45 minutes, you're going to hear a beep when my timer goes off. But yeah, first things first, thanks to the AFLA team for pulling off a really great virtual conference. It's been pretty amazing so far. And I don't think it could have gone any better than it has. So thank you very much for that. In this talk, I hope to demonstrate how we can use a more theoretically informed approach to issues in comparative Austronesian studies to hopefully better understand the underlying motivations behind the observed sound changes instead of what we typically do in comparative linguistics, which is maybe discover and describe sound changes, perhaps state what the phonetic motivations might be, and then move on. What I hope to do is to show how the inherited grammar of the proto-language itself may be responsible for sound changes targeting specific types of sound changes over others. And we'll talk about that a little bit during this talk. So I'll just get started here with the fundamental questions that have been motivating this research. They're basically threefold. One, what can a theory of constraint, interaction, and movement tell us about sound change? Through comparative analysis, can we infer the constraint ranking of a historical language? And does the outcome of sound change provide us with enough information to understand the nature of constraint movement itself? So in this talk, I'm going to be discussing 3 main types of sound changes that seem to appear throughout Malayo-Polynesian languages. And I'll try to tie those sound changes together as resulting from the promotion of the binary foot requirements, abbreviated foot binary, which is a constraint that I've defined here as stating that feet are binary at the syllabic or Moraic level. And in this case, we'll be talking about the Moraic level. And the sound changes that this constraint promotion appears to motivate in Malayo-Polynesian are listed there. So one is the deletion of schwa when it appears in the penultimate syllable of 3-syllable words. The other is the gemination of final syllable onsets in 2-syllable words, where schwa appears in an open penult. And then third is the shift of schwa to o in the penultimate syllable, but not in any other syllables. And of course, this constraint seems to motivate additional sound changes, but I'm just going to be focusing on these 3 for this talk. And hopefully in future research, we'll be able to incorporate some of the additional sound changes into this model. And so I've listed them in order of attestation. Schwa deletion in 3-syllable words is a near universal feature of Malayo-Polynesian. Gemination of final syllable onsets is very common, but is absent in some subgroups. And the shift of schwa to o appears to have only happened once in the history of Austronesian languages, and that's in Eastern Malayo-Polynesian. And it was then inherited by its daughter languages, South Halmahera, West New Guinea, and Oceanic. So here's how we're going to progress from here. I'll give a little bit of background on OT and how it's used in the study of diachronic sound change. I'll give some background on Proto-Oceanesian and Proto-Malayo-Polynesian phonology and phonotactics, which will help inform some of the later analysis. I'll discuss the evidence that schwa was a zero more a vowel in Proto-Austronesian, something that was inherited in Proto-Malayo-Polynesian and its daughter languages. Then I'll do an overview of the diverse repairs that were triggered by the interaction of schwa and foot minimality. And then finally, I'll do the diachronic OT analysis and demonstrate how the step-by-step promotion of foot binary seems to have triggered these changes. And I'll conclude with the observation that sound change seems to follow naturally from inherited rankings based on restrictions, that constraints move gradually one at a time. That'll become more clear as we go through the talk. So the first background section is on OT. Of course, everybody probably already knows that OT explains differences in input and output as arising from the interaction of ranked viable constraints. In diachronic OT, we view sound change as being as involving constraint re-ranking. So in this very simple first example here, I show how the promotion of a constraint, in this case the no-coda constraint, over an intervening constraint such as max, might trigger a sound change like coda deletion, which is something that we see in multiple Austronesian languages. But we can't just have constraints jump over each other willy-nilly. They have to move in some sort of ordered fashion. And it has to incorporate what we see in the empirical evidence of how sound change is implemented. So the first thing that we want to make note of is that sound change occurs with the necessary stage of variability in its implementation. So it's therefore necessary to have a theory of constraint movements that has variability built into its framework. And of course, there are ways to model variability synchronically, but because I'm looking at sound change as it occurs over time, I'm going to be working specifically with some assumptions from the diachronic re-ranking hypothesis, which basically states that constraints enter a stage of variable ranking with one another before re-ranking occurs. And in a tableau, we indicate this with the use of a vertical dotted line. And some examples might help demonstrate this using the same coda deletion scenario from earlier. So here what we see in 3A is that you have the three constraints, step, max, and no coda, listed in this ranking, with the faithful output A being the chosen output because of the ranking of no coda low relative to the other constraints. In the diachronic re-ranking hypothesis, before no coda can promote over max, it must first enter a stage of variability with max, which in 3B results in variable outputs, either the faithful output or the output with coda deletion. Once no coda is promoted over max, variability continues until the new ranking solidifies itself as in 3D, which gives us the new innovative output as the licit output, and the faithful output is no longer licit. And in historical sound change, the deletion output would then eventually be lexicalized and would become the new input for further sound change that would happen later down the line. So that's the model that we'll be working with, the diachronic re-ranking hypothesis, which allows us to incorporate intermediate variability into our formal description of sound change. So constraint movement therefore happens gradually. Re-ranking, rather than being viewed as a singular event, is a gradual event with multiple intermediate stages and abundant variability. And one of the consequences of looking at constraint rankings, re-rankings this way, is that we see constraint movement as happening in short rather than long movements. And what that basically means is that constraints can only interact and promote and demote over immediately adjacent constraints. You can't hop over constraints as a constraint is promoted over time. So I've provided a definition here to hopefully get that point across a little bit better, this gradual movement definition, that the promotion or demotion of constraints occurs in short rather than long movements. And given a proto-ranking ABC, constraint C may only come to dominate A if it first passes through an intermediate stage, ACB. And if you look at the literature on diachronic re-ranking, you kind of get a mixture. There are some studies that seem to adhere to this principles, others that don't. And what I'm going to be, the sound changes that we'll be looking at in Austronesian seem to strictly adhere to this principle, even in cases where constraints appear to jump over other constraints. We still find evidence that it passed through an intermediate stage first, and we'll look at that a little bit later. So moving on, we'll get to the preliminaries of Austronesian phonology. Starting with word shape, Proto-Austronesian, of course, had a two-syllable canonical word. Consonant clusters were restricted to reduplicated monosyllables, a subset of the lexicon. In example 4, I just give some quick examples of that. Extra points to anybody who can successfully gloss those 3 Proto-Austronesian reconstructions there. Roughly 90% of all reconstructed Austronesian vocabulary conforms to this disyllabic requirement, which is a lot. There were some 3-syllable and 1-syllable words in Proto-Austronesian, but they formed a small minority. We did have 3-syllable content words, but the monosyllabic words were always grammatical words that were phonologically bound to adjacent content words, so they didn't create phonological words on their own. And in 5, I've just given some examples of these grammatical monosyllables. So moving on to the vowels. In Proto-Austronesian, there were 4 vowels, and I argue that these 4 vowels are divisible into 2 types. There's the 3 main vowels, a, e, and u, and then there's a minor or reduced vowel, which was schwa. And schwa seems to have a lot of unique properties, not just in Proto-Austronesian in the reconstructed phonology, but also in modern languages. It's inherited with a lot of these same special properties. So of the properties that we can reconstruct, I've listed several of them here. In Proto-Austronesian, schwa was banned from word final position, from word initial position. It was absent from prefixing and infixing morphology, so morphology preferred the full vowels to a reduced vowel. And schwa had restrictions on what consonants could immediately follow it. It necessitated more consonant-like consonants, and it didn't allow W or Y, the glides, to follow it in the proto-vocabulary. So schwa also seemed to have had some interactions with stress in Proto-Austronesian. I've argued elsewhere that Proto-Austronesian had a default penultimate stress system, but that stress could shift to the final syllable under some conditions. There were morphological conditions that caused stress to shift to the final syllable, and I've listed those there. I won't go through them one by one. But there was also a phonetic condition on stress in Proto-Austronesian. So in 6a and 6b, I give 2 typical, I've schematized 2 typical words where stress falls on the penultimate syllable. But in 6c, you can see that if schwa was present in an open penultimate syllable, that stress, rather than appearing on the penult, shifted to the final syllable. So this is another one of the unique properties of schwa. And this claim that Proto-Austronesian had a regular stress system is not without its detractors. I've cited some of them here, so I'm just going to try to quickly go over a little bit of the evidence in support of this reconstruction, since it is still a little bit controversial. But in terms of attestation of this stress system in primary branches, there are at least 3 primary branches of Austronesian that seem to continue this system directly. One is Western Plains, of which Thou is a member. And in 7a here, you can see that words that are reconstructed with a schwa and an open penult, those words have stress on the final syllable in modern Thou. But in 7b, words that are reconstructed with a full vowel in the penult or with schwa and a closed syllable in the penult, those words have the regular penultimate stress system. The same is true for Paiwan, which makes up a second primary branch of Austronesian. I don't have a lot of examples here, but Chen 2004 provides a pretty good phonetic description of Paiwan, and you can reference that for the full description. But long story short, in Paiwan, stress is penultimate unless there's a schwa in the penultimate syllable, in which case stress is final. So it's the same. And then the third primary branch where we find this system is Malayo-Polynesian, and multiple divisions therein. Sorry, I'm trying to pull up my timer there. So I have just a few examples here. Ilocano is, of course, a language that has contrastive stress, but the contrastive system is neutralized when you can reconstruct a schwa to a penultimate syllable. In those cases, stress is predictably on the final syllable, as in 9a as compared to 9b. Kenya, which is a language of Borneo, has the exact same system. In 10A, words that are reconstructed with a schwa penult have word final stress. In 10B, words without schwa in the penult have regular penultimate stress. Ngadza, which is a Central Malayo-Polynesian language, has the exact same system. And the list just goes on and on and on. As you can see here at the bottom, several subgroups within the Philippines, in Borneo, and Sumatra, and other languages in the Central Malayo-Polynesian group all seem to have this system where stress is regularly on the penultimate syllable but shifts to the final syllable after schwa. So there's abundant evidence, is what I'm trying to say, that this reconstructed stress system is the actual stress system of Proto-Malayo-Polynesian and Proto-Austronesian. And the other point that I'm trying to hammer home is that schwa was special. But precisely how was it special? And that's what I'm going to be talking about next. I'll be making an argument that schwa was a zero mora vowel, which basically means that its special properties don't derive from its shortness or from its schwaness, which is what some people have claimed, but its special properties derive specifically from the fact that it lacks a mora and it doesn't contribute that mora to lexical mora counts. And it's not uncommon for languages cross-linguistically to be analyzed as having syllables that are zero moras or vowels that are zero moras. So for example, in Georgian and Polish, we have examples of syllables as being analyzed as having no mora. And in Dutch, German, Malayalam, for example, we have examples of schwa specifically being a zero mora vowel. And Malayalam is even more interesting because the lack of a mora in schwa is responsible for segmental phenomena that appear to be in response to a word minimum requirement. And I'll show that example here because we're going to see direct parallels of this when we get to the Austronesian examples. So in Malayalam, they have a 2 mora word minimum, and they also have restrictions on what consonants can appear in coda position. So when English words are borrowed into Malayalam with a disallowed coda, Malayalam fixes that by inserting a schwa to the end of the word. And I have some examples here in 12, 12a and 12b, both monosyllabic borrowings from English, pass and bus. In 12a, pass is borrowed with an underlyingly long vowel, and in 12b, bus is borrowed with a short vowel. When a schwa is added to the end of the word pass, because there's already a long vowel there, the word already meets the 2 mora requirements and no segmental changes are necessary. But when a 0 mora schwa is added to the end of the word bus, which has a short vowel, the word is subminimal and it needs to correct that through some sort of repair. And in this case, you can see that that repair is the gemination of the consonant in word medial position. And we're going to see that exact same pattern play out in Austronesian languages when we look at those examples. But very quickly, though, before we get to that, I just need to make one pit stop here to talk about variable weight. Because when we look at the data in the following sections, you're going to see something that I've alluded to in previous slides, that these word minimum phenomena only appear when schwa is in an open syllable. If schwa is in a closed syllable, then we don't get any of these sorts of repairs. And the obvious explanation for that is that when schwa is in a closed syllable, the coda is contributing weight to that syllable. With one small caveat, in Austronesian, in Proto-Austronesian and Proto-Malayo-Polynesian, and in many Austronesian languages, especially Western Austronesian languages, codas don't seem to add weight to syllables unless that syllable has a schwa nucleus. So coda is only called to add weight if the syllable is itself deficient moraically. And we can see this in Standard Malay, for example, in 13a. If you have an open penult with a regular vowel, the vowel connects to a mora, which then connects to the syllable head. In 13b, if you have a penult with a schwa, schwa directs directly to the syllable head with no mora. And in 13c, if schwa is in a closed syllable, schwa and the coda both connect to a mora, and then that mora connects to the syllable head. So the coda there is able to contribute weight to that syllable. It's not just a Malay phenomenon, it occurs in other languages as well. It occurs in Vowel and historical phonology. And we'll see this play out over and over again as words with schwa and a close penult fail to trigger the types of repairs that we see with schwa and open penults. And in 15 here, I've just listed some of the attested repairs. The important part is 15E, F, and G, where you see that schwa with a coda doesn't trigger any of the repairs that I'm going to be talking about. So let's get to it then. Since we just talked about Malayalam not too long ago, we're going to start with gemination. If you remember, I said that there were 3 sound changes that I'm going to link to the promotion of the binary foot, one of them being gemination of consonants. So I have examples here from Ilocano. I use a lot of examples from Ilocano in this talk. I didn't do that on purpose. So Ilocano has a contrastive stress system, as I've already mentioned, but that stress is neutralized in words with the penultimate schwa syllable, which I've also already mentioned. But the important thing here is in 16A, when you have a schwa in the penult, the onset to the final syllable is a geminate in these words fathom, hear, listen, and punching pole. But if you have a full vowel in the penult, that doesn't, you can't use that to predict gemination of the final syllable onset. The same thing is true in Central Malayo-Polynesian with data from Hawu and from Ngadza. So 17A is Hawu data. You can see that a schwa in a penult here results in the lengthening of the consonant that comes after it. And in 17B, this data is from Ngadza. The exact same thing happens with additional aspiration of the consonant. The same thing happens in Borneo, of course. Kayan is a language of Borneo that doesn't have geminates except in specific contexts, such as when schwa appears in the penultimate syllable. You get the automatic gemination of the final syllable onset there in those 6 examples. Another case is Sabah, which is North Borneo, where the language Iraan Bagak triggers automatic gemination of final syllable onsets if the schwa is an open penult, just as before. And you also get the little extra bonus here when you geminate in this language a voiced plosive, it undergoes final devoicing, so you get tabpu in sugarcane, but it's still a long consonant. And this also happens in South Sulawesi. So in South Sulawesi languages, you get the automatic gemination of consonants after open schwa penult, even if that schwa has since been eliminated through subsequent sound changes. So example 20 is from Makassarese. And here you can see in 20A, a full vowel does not trigger gemination, whereas in 20B, a schwa penult does trigger gemination. So this is a very widespread phenomenon in Malayo-Polynesian, and it has one very, I think, obvious goal, and that is to add a mora to a word that is lacking the 2 moras necessary. The next sound change is schwa deletion in 3-syllable words, which is more widely attested in Malayo-Polynesian, but perhaps slightly less obviously motivated by a 2 mora foot requirement. Nearly all Malayo-Polynesian languages show an intermediate stage of penultimate schwa deletion when schwa appears in the penultimate syllable of a 3-syllable word, although in many languages this deletion is irregular. In keeping with the theme of this presentation, apparently I'm going to use some Ilocano examples here to talk about this. In 21A, I've just repeated the examples where you get gemination after schwa in a 2-syllable word, but in 21B, you can see that in 3-syllable words, we don't have any sort of attested gemination. What we have instead is the deletion of schwa in the penultimate syllable. And there's a reason that schwa deletion would occur in 3-syllable words, but not 2-syllable words. And of course, that reason is that if you delete the schwa in a 3-syllable word, what you get is a 2-syllable word that you can form a foot around, and that foot will consequently have 2 mora. If schwa deleted in a disyllable, then the resulting monosyllabic word would still be subminimal, and I've given an example there at the bottom. So yeah, there's no motivation there for schwa deletion in 2-syllable words. There are other possible explanations for why schwa would delete in a 3-syllable word, but we can tie all of this together if we analyze this as being driven by foot minimality. So the deletion of schwa in 3-syllable words is completely regular in the Philippines. It's also regular in Chamorro, and it's regular in a few other subgroups within Malayo-Polynesian. Outside of the Philippines, especially in the western portion of Malayo-Polynesian, what you find is that schwa deletion in three-syllable words appears to have been an irregular phenomenon, or at least it was lexicalized irregularly. And I have some examples here in 22. So in 22A, the word for new deleted the schwa penults in South Sulawesi and Central Malayo-Polynesian, but if you looked at the data, you would see that there are some other three-syllable words in these same subgroups where schwa was not deleted. In 22B, the same thing is true for Proto-Oceanic. Proto-Oceanic is actually reconstructed with quite a number of words where schwa deleted in the penultimate syllable. The word for day is one of them, but there are also other words in Proto-Oceanic where schwa didn't delete in this environment. In 22C, we have an example from Proto-Western Indonesian, which includes all of the languages of Borneo and most of the languages to the west of Borneo. In Western Indonesian, we have a mixture of deletion of schwa and retention of schwa, depending on the subgroup that you're in. So in these languages, there seems to have been some sort of irregular lexicalization of schwa deletion. But importantly, all of these subgroups show some sign of schwa deletion, be it regular or irregular. And the final sound change that I'm going to talk about here is vowel shift, but a specific type of vowel shift. So in a lot of in one specific subgroup, schwa shifted, that's difficult to say, schwa shifted from schwa to a full vowel, but it only happened in the penultimate syllable. So there are some languages where schwa shifts to a full vowel in all of the syllables, but we're really interested in languages where that shift is restricted to the penultimate syllable. And the reason is because if that shift is restricted to the penultimate syllable, then the motivation behind that is much more clearly the result of minimality requirements rather than some sort of just schwa deletion through the general shift of schwa in all syllables. And we do find a case where this appears to have happened, and that's in Eastern Malayo-Polynesian, which most of you already know consists of two subgroups, Oceanic and South Halmahera, West New Guinea. This isn't really talked about very much in the literature, but it was noticed quite a long time ago by Blust. And I'll read this quote here from his 1978 publication where he notes that Proto-Oceanesian schwa unconditionally yielded Proto-Oceanic O, most of us already know that, but only penultimate schwa yielded Proto-South Halmahera, West New Guinea O. And he goes on to state that it was probably Proto-Eastern Malayo-Polynesian where schwa shifted to O in the penultimate syllable, and that shift was later generalized to schwa in all positions in Proto-Oceanic. And the schematic for that is listed here in example 23. So in 23A, you have a schwa in an open penultimate syllable in Proto-Malayo-Polynesian, which yields an O in the penultimate syllable in Proto-Eastern Malayo-Polynesian. Crucially, that also increases the more count from 1 to 2. In 23B, you get shift of schwa in the penultimate syllable, but not in the final syllable, because the final syllable is, of course, closed. And you'll remember from earlier in the talk, I mentioned that schwa could not appear in an open final syllable. It only appeared in closed final syllables. And in 23C, you can see once again schwa remaining schwa in a closed final syllable. And there's some data to back this up, of course. And all of these languages listed here are Schwing languages, Matya, Taba, and Buli. In Matya 24 and 24A, schwa in a penultimate syllable is reflected with O. And in 24B, schwa in a final syllable is reflected with E. So it has two different reflexes depending on the syllable that it appears in. In Taba and Buli, schwa in a penultimate syllable is of course reflected as O, as it is in Matya, but it's reflected as A in the final syllable in these two subgroups. So in 25B, you can say that Unam yields Onam, and in Buli, in all three of those examples, you can see A in a final syllable, but O in a penultimate syllable. So the fact that schwa has two different reflexes in the final syllable means that it was still schwa in the proto-language. So those are the three sound changes and the evidence behind them that I'm going to now talk about in terms of constraint movement. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to look at each sound change one by one and just very quickly discuss the necessary rankings in order to trigger those changes. We'll start with Schwa deletion, since that's the most common sound change that seems to be motivated by this. And you can see here that if you have the binary foot constraint ranked over max, which is an anti-deletion constraint, what you get is an output where in 27A, Schwa deletion violates max, but Schwa retention violates the binary foot requirement, which is ranked higher, meaning that the deletion output is the licit output. In 27B, both outputs violate the binary foot constraint, so that's a tie that's broken by max, and you get the faithful output in 27B. So the interaction of these two constraints is all that's really necessary to produce the observed outcomes. With gemination after a penultimate schwa, there's different ways that we can approach this. So the most obvious way is to have the binary foot requirement interact with the anti-gemination constraint, in which case, if foot binary is ranked above star gem, then what you get is gemination in both cases. So in 28A, the three-syllable word geminates to satisfy the binary foot constraint, and in 28B, you get the exact same thing. An alternative approach to get the same output is to have foot binary interact with a mora dependency. And this constraint basically states that all mora in the output must also appear in the input. This, of course, assumes that moras are assigned in the input, which is an assumption that not everybody makes. But nevertheless, there are several reasons why mora dependency might be preferable to that should be star gem. And the biggest reason is that there are some languages where consonants geminate through alternative means, not as a reaction to a foot minimality requirement. So in Batak languages, for example, you get the full assimilation of consonants and consonant clusters, resulting in a geminate output. That suggests that gem was not very highly ranked. Also, more dependency allows us to get more work with fewer constraints. For example, it not only prevents gemination, but it also prevents vowel shift, since both gemination and vowel shift are mora addition strategies. So you can use that one constraint to motivate multiple sound changes. And we'll see how that works when we put all of this together. Finally, we have the constraint ranking for penultimate vowel shift. As you might have already guessed, all that you have to do is have the binary foot requirement outrank vowel identity. And that will result in 30A with penultimate vowel shift, but in 30B without word final vowel shift, because in 30B, the ultimate syllable is still moraic since it's closed. And so you have a single violation of vowel identity that results in the faithful output. Okay. So if we put all of this together and we try to come up with some sort of proto-ranking for Proto-Malayo-Polynesian, all that you have to do is rank the binary foot requirement as low as possible. The ranking that I have here isn't the only ranking that would give faithful outputs. You could have ident and star gem ranked above the binary foot requirements, and you would get the same outputs. But there's reason to believe that the binary foot constraint is ranked adjacent to max. And the reason for that is because if constraints move in gradual movements where they must interact first with the constraint that they're immediately adjacent to, then that means we expect foot binary to first promote over whatever constraint is to its immediate left. And there's reason to believe that the very first promotion event to foot binary is an event that triggered penultimate vowel deletion in three-syllable words. And I'll show how that happens here. So let's see, I don't want to reread things. Yeah, so in 32, I've just shown the constraint ranking with the re-ranking event that gives a new output with the binary foot requirement ranked over max. And when that gives us in 33, is some of the observed sound changes that we see in Philippine languages. So in 33A, now that foot binary outranks max, it makes the faithful output illicit, and it makes the vowel deletion output now the winning candidates. So in 33A, we see that D, a two-syllable word where schwa has been deleted, is the best output. But in 33B, because of reasons that I've already discussed, deletion does not win out. The faithful output continues to win out even though it violates foot binary. So that single promotion event is enough to trigger deletion in three-syllable words, but not two-syllable words, and it's also does not trigger gemination in any of the words that we see so far. And that's good because, as I'll show later, in a lot of languages, you get deletion without gemination. But next is gemination. So we've seen that the binary foot requirement promoted over max, and it's going to continue its journey upwards by now promoting over more dependency. And when that happens, we get gemination in two-syllable words. You'll notice in 35A that the input to the tableau is the output of the previous tableau. That is, it's the schwa deletion input right here. So the input has changed. But since we're dealing with sound change over time, that's expected. We expect the output of past sound changes to feed later sound changes. So in 35A, the deletion, the faithful output is still the correct output. And in 35B, since foot binary has now promoted to an adequate level, we can see that it triggers gemination in the two-syllable word there. And the reason that gemination is triggered here and not an alternative strategy like vowel shift is because the tie at more dependency is broken by the ranking of vowel identity versus star gem further down the tableau. And that's important. And that is going to have an effect on vowel shift as a sound change that we'll get to later on. So why should the binary foot requirement promote over max and then dep? The reason is here in 36. In 36, I have three languages where it appears that the binary foot constraint promoted over max but did not promote over dep. That's Palawan, Cebuano, two Philippine languages, and then Chamorro. In those languages, you have no signs of gemination, past or present, but you have the regular deletion of schwa in three-syllable words across the board. And then you have other languages like Ilocano, Isnag, and Tayet, where you have both schwa deletion in three-syllable words and gemination after penultimate schwa in two-syllable words. So the fact that these two groups of languages exist suggests that the promotion event first targeted max and then targeted more dependency. And this is just a schematic of how that series of changes took place over time. So before moving on to the changes that are necessary to trigger vowel shift, I'm just going to quickly talk about irregularity and constraint re-ranking. So I've shown that schwa deletion in three-syllable words occurred fairly regularly throughout the Philippines and in Chamorro. And I already mentioned how when we get to other subgroups, especially to the west, we find that that sound change was implemented irregularly. And we need to deal with that. And so here are some more examples. I had a few earlier, but here's just a few more showing the variable implementation of penultimate schwa deletion. For the word for new, we have deletion in South Sulawesi, Central Malayo-Polynesian. The word for heavy, we have deletion in Western Indonesian and Central Malayo-Polynesian. The word for gall, we have a lack of deletion in Western Indonesian and some other subgroups there. In D, with the word for ladder, we also have a lack of deletion, although in this word there may be other forces at play because it seems that the antepenultimate syllable might have deleted completely, giving a two-syllable word in most of these subgroups. But in E and F, these are the most interesting words. The word for day has schwa deletion in some subgroups, schwa retention in other subgroups, not just in the West, but also in Oceanic. And in F, the word for bone, this is the word that I mentioned earlier that has various implementations. Sometimes schwa deletes and sometimes it doesn't. So how can we account for this? The diachronic re-ranking hypothesis already requires an intermediate stage of variability. So in some ways, it predicts that there might be cases where the variable stage is fossilized or lexicalized in an irregular manner. And we can see this when we look at how the diachronic re-ranking hypothesis interacts with the lexical diffusion hypothesis of sound change. And what lexical diffusion basically states is that sound changes are lexicalized not all at once, but gradually. The sound change works its way through the lexicon of a language. The sound change doesn't happen all at once. And so when we're at the variable pronunciation stage, if the constraint moves up before lexical diffusion has had a chance to lexicalize the variable output, then what you'll have is lexicalized variation in the daughter languages. And that appears to be what we have in Western Malayo-Polynesian languages. And I don't have a whole lot of time left, so I'm going to try to go through these slides very quickly. It's a little bit confusing, but I've tried to show how this might have taken place with these three words. And let me give you the glosses real quick. So I'll be using the word for bone, the word for ladder, and the word for gall or bile. At this first stage, foot and max have entered a variable relationship with one another because foot binary has started its journey up to the top of the tableau. And that gives us two different outputs here. You have the faithful output A, and you have the deletion output C. What happens next is really important. So the various sound changes that are implemented in Western Indonesian are lexicalized via the lexical diffusion hypothesis, and simultaneously, other sound changes are taking place that are interfering with the implementation of the foot binary promotion. So first is that pre-penultimate vowels fell together as schwa in Western Indonesian languages, and second, schwa deleted if it was in word initial position. And these three sound changes, how they interact with the three words that I'm modeling here depends on how lexicalization played out. The word for bone, which is the first one, tuklang, lexicalizes with schwa deletion. The word for ladder, rejang, lexicalizes without. And the word for gall, kepeju, also lexicalizes without schwa deletion. The result of that, plus the sound changes that took place earlier, means that we get variable outputs in the modern languages here. You have schwa deletion and reflexes of bone, and you have gemination in reflexes of ladder and gall. And in this tableau, you see that foot binary has made its way to the very top. So in this sense, what you see is that in these languages, the diachronic re-ranking hypothesis and lexical diffusion have interacted with each other in such a way as to give variable outputs of this sound change. But the important thing about this is that even though foot binary promoted over both max and dep and is now at the top of the tableau, the irregular lexicalization of the schwa deletion outputs is a hint that foot binary didn't just jump to the top of the tableau, it worked its way up there over time, which is what I hypothesize will happen with the gradual movement requirement of constraint movement. So this is a fairly important piece of evidence. And then the final sound change that I'm going to model in this way is penultimate vowel shift. So the approach that I've taken to diachronic re-ranking predicts that sound changes which require more constraint movement will be less attested across the family than sound changes that require less constraint movement. So schwa deletion, for example, is very widely attested and it requires only a single promotion of foot binary over max. Gemination is less attested because it requires multiple promotions of foot binary. Vowel shift requires not only a promotion of the binary foot requirement, but the necessary demotion of vowel identity to such a point that it allows vowel shift rather than gemination to be the repair strategy for a subminimal word. And that's what we have here modeled in 43A and B. So in 43A, I think my alarm's going to go off in just a moment. I'm going to preemptively turn it off. Okay. In 43A, foot binary has promoted all the way to the top of the tableau, but vowel identity is ranked so high that it doesn't allow vowel shift to occur. That in 43B, foot binary is promoted to the very top of the tableau, while vowel identity is simultaneously demoted and star gem is promoted over it. The result of that is a sound change that is only attested once because of the complexity of the changes needed, but is nevertheless attested once. So that gives some evidence here that the multiple constraint movements necessary for the sound change are the reason why it is so rarely attested, even though it's logically just as good as gemination as a solution to subminimal feet. So to conclude, 3 sound changes: deletion of the penultimate schwa syllable in 3-syllable words, gemination of final syllable onsets, and shift of schwa to a full vowel in the penultimate syllable all appear to restore subminimal words to a 2-more minimum. The binary foot requirement promotion over intervening constraints may motivate these changes, and the inherited ranking of constraints results in specific outcomes. So I've listed the changes here with the constraint rankings that are necessary. I won't go over those individually, because I've already run out of time. And so finally, just to conclude, when sound change occurs that eliminates a marked structure, the choice of output depends on the rankings of other constraints. In diachronic OT, we can see that the motivation for a certain sound change to occur more frequently than another equally motivated sound change is the result of the inherited rankings and the requirement that constraints move step by step in gradual movements. Finally, the variation in the implementation of sound change, such as the variable deletion of schwa, is the product of intermediate variability as predicted by the diachronic re-ranking hypothesis. In Malayo-Polynesian, we see that the swift promotion of foot binary occurred before lexicalization of syncopated outputs, and the lexical diffusion model of sound change, along with the diachronic re-ranking hypothesis, provides an explanation for medial Schwa deletion irregularity, which has until now been treated as a random subgroup-wide irregularity. But we can see here is that it's actually the product of the nature of constraint re-ranking itself. And that's it. Thank you very much for listening. I'm happy to take questions or comments.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We have 12 minutes for questions. And I believe now you can unmute yourself or to indicate that you have a question in the chat. If you indicate yourself, I'll call on you.
Oh, not.
Okay. First question, let's go to Kanan. You have a question, you can unmute yourself.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks for this very interesting talk. So I have a question. How are rankings inherited in diachronic OT?
So basically, every language has constraints and they're ranked somehow with regards to one another. That's true for modern languages, it's true for proto-languages. The inheritance is not inheritance in the sense that a sound change is inherited. It's just the properties of the proto-language that give rise to the new rankings. So inherited might be a slightly wrong word, but basically what it means is that it's the ranking of the proto-language from which constraint re-ranking must work upon, so that sound change, instead of being random, is motivated by the ranking of the proto-language. That's what I mean when I say inherited.
Can I just make sure I understand that? The properties of generation 1 of the proto-language is such that the learners of generation 2, hearing their parents speak, kind of inevitably arrive at a ranking that you're saying must be only minimally different from their parental ranking, but that minimal difference is a property of their learning data, not necessarily of their kind of seeing the constraints in their parents' heads. Is that, just to make sure I understand?
Yes, yes.
Okay, thanks.
The next question, Yiming.
Hi, thanks, Alex. So I also have a diachronic OT question. This is like my first look into diachronic uses of OT, and I wanted to ask, is it just part of the enterprise that markedness constraints continue to be promoted just through time because of the way reconstruction works? Because if we think about how learning algorithms in OT work, it's usually, I think people assume, faithfulness constraints that get promoted over time, right? Children start with very unmarked productions, and then faithfulness gets pushed up, or markedness gets demoted over time. But for diachronic OT, it seems like the opposite. So I was wondering if you have any thoughts as to, is this just kind of part of the way that we do historical work? We assume that faithfulness is kind of the first thing, and then markedness gets promoted over time. Thanks.
Yeah, I guess that sort of depends on where you consider sound change to take place in the speech community itself. So there are, of course, theories that sound change is in imperfect learning on the part of children within the speech community. And then I mean, that might be true, might not be true. There's also theories that sound change is not strictly a property of the improper learning by children, but just a property of language use by a community in general. But sound change itself happens in a way that's much different from language learning. So sound change often moves to eliminate marked structures, which in OT would be modeled through the promotion of markedness constraints, of course. Whereas child learning, as you stated, is sort of the opposite. It starts with hardly any markedness whatsoever, and then the markedness is entered through the promotion of markedness constraints. So yeah, I think that the nature of sound change itself is quite different from the nature of language learning when you talk about language learning in children specifically. So yeah, I think it might just be two different problems that we're looking at there.
Well, I think one way you could connect it is to say that if we go with the imperfect learning of children as one instance of instigator of sound change, then you can say that markedness constraints, if they're not demoted enough in child acquisition, then they result in a historical sound change, resulting in reduced markedness.
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it, certainly. I don't see why it couldn't be both improper learning on the part of children and other things that motivate sound change at the same time. Yeah, that's good.
Thanks.
Next question, we go to Matt.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Great. Thanks. Very interesting talk. I have also a question about diachronic OT. It might be a naive question. I don't know. I don't know very much about diachronic OT, but I'm interested in this gradual movement assumption. So when you say that when constraint re-ranking happens, a constraint can only promote or demote over an adjacent constraint. So when you said that raised the question in my head, well, how do we determine if two constraints are adjacent or not? We can look at the output to determine their ranking, but like how close are they on the ranking? Are they adjacent or not? And it seemed from my understanding of your talk that you were giving diachronic evidence that we could use for whether two constraints are adjacent or not, right? Because their re-ranking would be a source of sound change.
Yeah.
But if the evidence is only diachronic, then we've got a circularity issue. So I'm wondering, do people who work on this, are there sort of independent ways that people assess whether two constraints are adjacent or not in a grammar?
So that also just hits the circularity problem in historical linguistics in general, right? Because we have to compare modern languages to do a reconstruction, but then we have to rely on the reconstruction to state the sound changes that took place to get to the modern language. So that circularity is not just a feature of diachronic OT, but it's sort of par for the course of historical linguistics and reconstruction in general. So yeah, there are some ways that you could try to infer the proto-ranking of constraints, which it's very data intensive, but essentially what you can do, and this is something that I'm trying to do but haven't done successfully yet, is if you're able to get enough subgroup-wide data on sound changes that have taken place and the constraints that might be necessary for those sound changes to take place, you can use probability models to infer what the proto-ranking might have been. So you use something similar to like a stochastic approach to optimality theory, which is used synchronically, but apply it to diachronic problems to possibly get an inference of what a proto-ranking, the most likely proto-ranking might have been. That's a way that you could possibly do it. But in terms of getting rid of the circularity altogether, yeah, it seems to just be an issue with reconstruction in and of itself, yeah. Since the proto-language, of course, is purely hypothetical.
Right. Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, there is a note in the chat by Emily. Really cool talk, thanks. Let me know if you ever want to chat Proto-SHWNG. Stress is underdocumented and weird and often interact with tone. Next question goes to Dan.
Thank you very much. Really interesting talk. Great stuff. So I have a question about reconstructing stress, and specifically Zorc's arguments that we should reconstruct Philippine-style contrastive stress to Proto-Austronesian. And more specifically, assuming that you're going to dismiss those arguments, the question, how do we then account for the correspondence between Batak, stress in Batak in the Philippines, and to what level of the tree we should reconstruct that stress system to? Thank you very much.
So the correspondences between stress in Batak and in the Philippines, from what I've looked at, all seem to be related to the morphological conditions on word final stress that I listed earlier in the talk. So I don't know if I can get back there in time or not. Yeah, I think I can. Let's see. Here. So there's several morphological conditions that get word final stress, and these can be reconstructed, some to Proto-Austronesian, others just to Proto-Malayo-Polynesian. And this work is heavily dependent on Zorc's work itself. So state of verbs, stress shifted to the final syllable as a way to indicate state of verbs. Vocatives were stressed on the final syllable, that's morphological stress. There are some noun to verb derivations. List intonation, so like enumeration, counting, is something that across Austronesian languages stresses on the final syllable, any sort of list. And then there was final syllable stress in close class words, so like deixis and things like that had word final stress rather than penultimate stress, but those are was either productive morphological stress or it was a closed class of words that specifically had stress. And where you see correspondences between Batak and Philippine languages, you are always able to explain that as following from these morphological conditions, as far as I can tell. So that's sort of, yeah, you said I was going to dismiss it, and there you go, that's how I do it.
So am I correct in understanding this response to mean that there's not, that we don't need to posit the arisal of a Philippine type stress system at some node that later became Sumatran and the Philippines to the exclusion of, right? We don't need to posit it.
I wouldn't. I mean, of course, anything's possible, but I don't think so. Yeah, it seems that the purely lexical stress phenomenon in the Philippines is something that happens either in Proto-Philippines itself or in subgroups within the Philippines. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for the talk and the questions and the discussion. We will have a break now. The next talk starts